Are you hearing clicks?
No. We're recording.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And everybody knows the sound of that voice. Joseph P. Farrell. And please visit his website, Giza Death Star. There is a PayPal button there. Please make use of it. And tonight we're kind of winging it. And I wanted to make a comment that there is a vast difference between truth and fact. People have their truth over there, and these people over here have their truth. Truth is very... it takes on a lot of colors.
Yeah.
But fact is fact. And that's what we're dealing with tonight. And Joseph, talk to us about Alexander Thom.
Oh. Well, first of all, thank you for having me back, Georgianne.
Of course.
And I want to, again, thank everybody that has made donations on the website and who've also become members, but particularly those who've made donations, because I just got done with, as you know, a book called Grid of the Gods.
Yes.
That I got off to the publisher, but that was a particularly expensive book to research.
Yeah.
Although I didn't cite all the sources that I researched, I did get a hold of quite a few rather expensive sources on Aztec and Mayan mythology in particular, and that was rather costly.
Yes.
Yes. But so I want to make sure to thank everybody for that, because it is expensive researching these books.
And incidentally, one of your people on your site, a very kind lady, made a donation to the Byte show, and I want to thank her.
I'm glad to hear that, Georgianne, because I know that you've been struggling. You get so many downloads and so few donations. And,
yes.
I hope people will exercise your PayPal button as well.
No, thank you.
But Alexander Thom was an Oxford engineer. And it's worth commenting even a bit about kind of the general atmosphere at the University of Oxford, because there's never been a want of scholars associated with that institution that are willing to crawl way out on limbs or crawl way outside of the normal standard academic box and research things. And Alexander Thom was one of these individuals. He was an engineer who made a study of the megalithic sites of Great Britain and also in northwestern France around Normandy and Brittany, some of the megalithic sites in France. And he concluded, based on very, very careful surveying of these sites, that the ancients that had built them had more or less a universal standard of measure, which just really threw him, because the standard of measure, he called it the megalithic yard, which was about 2.72 of our modern British imperial yard, 2.72 feet, which of course our modern yard is about 3 feet. But he concluded that they had come up with a fairly uniform system of measure, and this indicated to him something very profound, that there was a very, very large, extensive, not only project or program of construction of these sites in megalithic times, but that for some reason they had decided upon a standard of measure that deviated, this was the thing that threw him, that deviated very, very little from site to site. In other words, the margins of error were very, very narrow. And he puzzled over this, Georgianne, for quite a long time, because he couldn't come up with any really good solution as to why they were able to reproduce this standard of measure over such a wide area with such a degree of accuracy. And in fact, at one point, he proposed a kind of megalithic bureau of weights and measures, to be sending out wooden rods, to distant places to make sure that they were constructing along the same standard of measure. Well, sending out wooden rods is going to increase your margin of error, and even Tome had some difficulties with that theory. But the important thing is that he established a unit of measure that appears to have been fairly widespread in fairly widespread use from Great Britain, and later on some other scholars found evidence that it was even in use as far away as megalithic structures in Greece. So in other words, you're dealing with a project, a construction project in which there is a common standard of measure. Now, in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I talk a great deal about this aspect of what I consider to be the activities of an elite of some sort.
Yes.
In promulgating a standard of weights and measures, because, of course, once you establish a linear unit of measure that is accurately reproducible, then you can establish measures of area and measures of volume. In other words, you simply rotate your linear unit of measure into 2 and then 3 dimensions, all right? Mm-hmm. So I think what we are looking at is an elite with an agenda. And the agenda, first of all, is to reestablish as quickly as possible, over as wide an area as possible, all the rudiments necessary for the conduct of commerce. Because, of course, if you are going to trade over great distances, you need a standard of weights and measures to do so.
Yes.
And that standard has to be uniform over those areas, all right? Mm-hmm. Now, the thing that I get into in that chapter of Genes Giants is that the only way to reproduce with accuracy over a wide area units of weight and measure that will not vary or will vary within acceptable margins of error, I should say, mm-hmm. is to do so on the basis of astronomically based units of measure and or geodetically, in other words, based upon measures of the Earth and so on, geodetically based units of measure. And that implies a final, really very crucial point. That implies that this elite had enough scientific sophistication to be able to do that. Mm. And that implies, of course, that we're not dealing with primitive megalithic builders. We're dealing with people that have a fairly sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and a fairly sophisticated knowledge of geodetic measures in order to be able to do that. So in other words, you're dealing with a sophisticated science.
Yes.
Once you admit that, then, of course, you're admitting the idea that these elites are, in my opinion, are surviving elites of that cosmic war that tore everything to pieces, and what they're trying to do is rebuild as quickly as possible. So in order to rebuild, of course, you're going to have a fairly substantial basis in commerce and trade. You can't rebuild civilization on the basis of hunter-gathering societies and village huts and cave dwellers.
Yeah.
So this is what I think is going on.
Well, what is the degrees in a circle? 366
yes.
versus 365 degrees and 360 degrees.
Right. Well, in my review of these systems of measures, it appears, and I cite the work of Christopher Knight and I think Alan Lomas, a book called Civilization 1, and then another book called Before the Pyramids. And they came to the conclusion, based on their studies of Tome's work and then on the basis of some of their own research, that there had been a primitive 366-degree system of measures that was eventually replaced by a much easier and more manageable system of 360 degrees, which of course is a Sumerian system of measure. And again, I want to emphasize something here. I begin I begin this Sumerian story in Gene's Giants, I continue it in the Grid of the Gods, because there's some other very fascinating relationships between the Sumerian system and music theory on the one hand, and then on the other hand, some really mind-blowing relationships to their system of measure and hyperdimensional physics. So, so the plot will thicken. If you think you've encountered some very strange information in Gene's Giant Monsters and Men, the story continues in the Grid of the Gods, and the ante is upped considerably. But basically, that system of 366 was replaced with 360 because it's just a more manageable system arithmetically.
But not necessarily totally accurate.
No, but again, let's go way back to something in the very first Cosmic War series that I talked about.
Okay.
When I talked about the idea of the pyramid having been a weapon, all right?
Yes.
And how physics was unified back then, not so much by constructing a theoretical model and then engineering a technology out of it, but rather by engineering a unification of the harmonic series of physics. And again, that, my example has always been the harmonic series that you're familiar with in music. Mm-hmm. Because if you sit at a piano and press down the keys of a piano in the order of the harmonic sequence, like say your fundamental note is C, and that it will establish a whole series of harmonic overtones, beginning with the octave, another note C, and then the fifth G, a fourth another C, a third the note E. But eventually you're going to come to a harmonic that if you're playing a piano keyboard is going to lie between B flat and A natural. In other words, in the natural harmonic series, there is a note that you cannot play on the keyboard. But in order for music to change keys during the course of the piece without having to stop and retune the whole instrument, you see, this is what the natural harmonic series would have required. In order to not have to do that, what was eventually done in music was they engineered a slight mathematical adjustment to allow you to use all 12 notes on the keyboard in any key without having to stop and retune it. So in other words, slight mathematical tinkering or tampering was done in order to make the system more manageable. All right? And I believe that this is what you see with these systems of measure. They tinkered with it, or they engineered a physical unification in order to make the system manageable, all right, and easy to manipulate, easy to negotiate your way around, all right?
Okay.
And it's very important, and I get into this very extensively in the Grid of the Gods. I get into the idea that for the ancient mind, for the ancient cosmology, there's a direct connection between their musical mathematics and their mathematics of astronomy, all right?
Okay.
And it all comes out of the same sort of mathematical tinkering with numerical ratios in order to make both systems work. So what I'm telling you is by virtue of that mathematical tinkering, that's the origin of the ancient notion of the music of the spheres. Because they were trying to comprehend all of the physics that they knew, both astronomically and sonically and everything else, in one comprehensive mathematical system. That's where all of this is coming out of. And Georgianne, when you study the details of this system, their accomplishment was truly breathtaking. It was as breathtaking in terms of what they were able to achieve and accomplish with it as Einstein's theory of relativity or as quantum mechanics. It was every bit as breathtaking and grand a scheme as those theories. So, this is what they were doing, and again, the motivation behind all of this is an elite is doing all of this, not only to create units of weights and measures in order to further commerce, but those same units weights and measure are in turn used precisely to measure astronomical data, to measure geodetical data, and so on and so forth. So this is a huge, huge system that they're putting into place.
Wow. Well, I found it interesting. The weight of the Earth was measured in barley seed.
Yes.
Oh, I mean,
yes.
My goodness.
There's a portion in that chapter where I talk about the Sumerians having measured, I forget what the exact number was, having measured the Earth the mass of the Earth in terms of the weight of barley seeds. All right.
It had many zeros behind it.
Yes, it had many zeros behind it. But the scary thing is that it was an accurate measure. So the problem was, you see, that again raises the problem.
Yeah.
This means that elite that is coming up with these weights and measures had to have had a clear sophistication in science that had to have come down from high antiquity. I mean, to produce accurate measures of that. And you'll recall in that chapter, I even point out that they have accurate measures of the velocity of light.
Yes.
And this is something, again, that supposedly doesn't get discovered until the modern era. Well, again, we're confronted with the fact that what's really going on is we're rediscovering all of this stuff.
Yes.
And, again, we've got to start giving the ancients a lot more credit than we've been giving them.
What about Marduk measured the structure of the deep?
Uh-huh. Well, that is actually a citation, a quotation from the Enuma Elish, the so-called Babylonian creation story.
Yes.
Right, which I first cited in my book, The Giza Death Star Destroyed, and I have been pointing to that particular verse of the Enuma Elish in the Cosmic War and virtually every book since then, because it's a very significant statement. In the context of the Enuma Elish, which, again, I have to point out to people, I do not buy the academic line that the Enuma Elish is a creation account, all right? Mm-hmm. That's what you would learn if you go to universities and read the Enuma Elish. They'll tell you it's a creation account. Well, I say balderdash. It's a war epic, because what it's recounting is the war of the gods, all right? Well, at the end of this war, after the destruction of Tiamat, which I interpret to be a planet, all right, that's the planet that blew up, that they exploded, all right, in this war. There's a curious statement that Marduk remeasured the structure of the deep. And, of course, the deep is the ancient term for, space.
Yeah. Quite
literally, local space. So what I'm saying is, in the aftermath of that cosmic war, the celestial mechanics of the solar system is like a bad transmission. It's not working in the same way it originally did, and everything has to be, if you're basing physics and science and measures on astronomical data, and you're all of a sudden missing a planet, well then, you have to recalculate everything. And that's essentially what Marduk does in the Enuma Elish. He's recording new data about the celestial mechanics of the solar system after that war, and after that planet is no longer there and is now replaced with the asteroid belt. So that's what's going on. And in that remeasuring is where I'm departing now in Gene Shine's Monsters and Men, because I think that's also a bit of a euphemism for the activity of this post-cosmic war elite in setting up all these weights and measures around the world and using more or less a common system of weights and measures around the world.
Well, that brings up something else.
Uh-huh.
The debt god.
Yes.
And the, there was a change in the elite that began to occur.
Right.
How do you mean that?
Well, that's not a question I go into deeply in Gene Strand's Monsters and Men.
Okay.
I've been alluding to this change. I've been alluding to these broad ideologies ever since Babylon's Banksters, where you have a closed system, an elite advocating closed systems of physics and finance, and then an elite advocating open systems of physics and finance.
Right.
But by the same token, you'll discover that both of these elites are also advocating a particularly strange view of religion and of God. All right? And in my opinion, when you're looking at those elites that are practicing open systems of physics and finance, they're the ones advocating a kind of, for want of a better expression, a corn god. In other words, a god of production, of fertility, virility, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
All right. And then the closed system elite that is advocating a closed system of physics and finance, by and large, you find in those associated with those views, you find the idea of a contract God. In other words, of mankind being indebted somehow to God and or the gods and owing them sacrifice. All right. Now, that's a story I pick up very strongly in the Grid of the Gods, particularly in the 7th chapter of the Grid of the Gods, because I explore the idea of how the practice of human sacrifice arose and why it arose and who was behind it. That's the most important question for me, is who was behind it. This notion that God or the gods required bloody sacrifice. And it's very interesting, Georgianne, that you find that pattern most typically, not always, but most typically emerging after, in other words, subsequent in the storyline. Sacrifice is not part of the original cosmology, let's put it that way.
Yes.
You find it emerging later, and it's peculiarly always in conjunction with one elite apparently supplanting another. Mm-hmm. And that's particularly the case if you read the legends of Mesoamerica. But I think, and I want to underline the words, I think that you find that as more or less a universal pattern. So, you know, that aspect alone, Georgianne, is huge, and it's got massive ramifications, of course, for history of religions and history of philosophy and ethics and so on.
Yes, exactly.
Well,
yeah, especially ethics.
Yes, especially ethics,
and
morality.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Sumerians appear to have derived their knowledge from far more ancient sources.
Yes.
This is a very interesting statement.
Well, again, what I'm trying to point out there is in order for this more or less uniform pattern of basing weights and measures on astronomical and or geodetical systems of weights and measures, this pattern cannot have originated simply by a primitive society, because it's one thing to be able, with primitive technology, to come up with reliable units of measure, of length, or even of area, which, using relatively primitive technology could do. Mm-hmm. But it's quite another thing, pardon me.
Do you need to take a break?
No, I think I'm okay if I can just get rid of this this dry cough. I just took a drink of my Dr. Pepper.
Okay.
it's quite another thing when you move to measures of volume. You can, pardon me, you can come up with accurate measures of volume by using known substances that will not vary in weight from one area to another, such as water.
Yeah.
But, pardon me, the real problem is when you get to people like the Sumerians who have an accurate estimation of the measure or mass of the Earth.
Yes.
That's the problem. It's a bigger problem when you get an ancient culture like that having an accurate measure of the velocity of light. And I'm just scratching the surface there. Wait till you read some of the stuff in Grid of the Gods. That stuff is truly mind-blowing. Because not only have they accurate measures of all of these things, they have accurate measures of the galactic center, they have accurate measures of radial velocity of planets, they have accurate measures of the coefficients of the constants of quantum mechanics, and so that stuff, Georgianne, cannot be there by any sort of technology that megalithic mankind had access to. It perforce, therefore, had to have been knowledge passed down from an extremely sophisticated scientific culture, at least as sophisticated, if not more so, than our own. So in other words, we're dealing with yet another set of evidence, and it's hard to argue with numbers. The archaeologists can stamp their feet, and the fundamentalists can thump their Bibles all they want. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot dispute the numbers, and they're there in some of these sites. And that, perforce, means that this is a knowledge coming down from high antiquity. So, and therefore from a culture that had a sophistication scientifically, and the sophistication to encode these things and to be able to pass them down. So you're looking at a huge program, Georgianne.
Yes, and when you're talking about sophistication, about 3,215 BC, Orkney Island.
Yes.
They even had plumbing.
Yes. There is a site on the Orkney Islands, which is in the extreme northern part of the British Isles, off the northern coast of Scotland. There is a site there called Skara Brae that, as I point out in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, looks to be like some sort of special university to train people that are members of this elite. And as you mentioned, there's plumbing, there's every evidence that this site was a supported site, because the Orkney Islands, of course, are so remote and there's virtually little or no agriculture there. So to sustain a site like that implies that you have a population out there of for want of a better expression, serfs, that are sustaining whatever elite is there, doing whatever it's doing. And I suspect that that site was precisely a kind of a training ground to teach people how to go out and derive these units of measure and locate structures on the landscape.
Boy.
It's a huge program, Georgianne, because look at what we're implying. We're implying that a cosmic war occurred.
Yes.
That an elite or elites survived from both sides of that war. Mm-hmm. And that they maintained a common purpose for millennia.
Yes.
And then went on, as I argue in Grid of the Gods, to construct all over the world sites according to a certain sort of plan. I read one scholar of the grid system that came right out and said, it's like we're living in the remains of a machine on a planetary scale.
Yeah.
And that, quite frankly, is what I think exactly it is. It's some sort of gigantic planetary machine. For what purpose? We'll talk about that when the book is out.
oh, my goodness. Well, you mentioned Iapetus.
Yes.
Saturn's moon.
Saturn's moon, yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, I've mentioned that before in the Cosmic War, and what I mentioned there is based largely on the work of Richard Hoagland. But Saturn's moon Iapetus is significant for this story because, number one, it is clearly an artificial object, and the reason you can say it's clearly an artificial object in spite of the fact that it's gigantic,
Yeah.
It's some 900 miles in diameter.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason you can say it's artificial is if you look at NASA's photographs of this so-called moon, the edges are straight.
Yeah.
They're not round. And in addition to that, as I've pointed out numerous times, it has 3 parallel ridges sticking up about 6 miles, running parallel around the entire equator of this thing. So it's like you have a seam around it.
Yes.
Around the entire equator, and there's a bunch of other stuff. But the most peculiar thing of it all is that when you run the numbers of Iapetus, its orbit is positioned around Saturn in such a way that the units of measure, when you crunch the numbers, that the units of measure are, guess what? Sumerian.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, oh my goodness.
Oh.
So what's that doing out there?
That's absolutely
amazing. That's a whopper.
Yeah, it is.
Because that's another little clue, you see, that all of this knowledge that we see popping up in Sumeria does indeed come from high antiquity and from a civilization that once did have interplanetary extent.
Yeah.
You see, so all of, it may seem like I'm writing books rather haphazardly, but I'm writing them very deliberately. This book stands in an arch of books that continues the story of the Cosmic War and its aftermath. That's what I'm really talking about now, is what happened after that war and what were they up to.
Yeah.
And why were they up to it.
Well, do you think that the survivors were off planet at the time?
That's an excellent question. In fact, I'm so glad you asked that. Right now, George Ann, I have basically 3 different scenarios that I think are logically possible.
Okay.
The first scenario is that there could have been off-planet survivors, that there's somebody out there that survived. The second scenario is that some of the elites that survived that war survived on this planet. And then the third scenario is, of course, that both occurred. In other words, we had an elite confined or elites confined to this planet and left to kind of rebuild, and elites off this world that were left to kind of rebuild.
Yes.
In all honesty, George Ann, my current thinking is it's probably that scenario that's true. In other words, that we've got cousins out there that survived that war, and then us here. All right.
Would they be called Anunnaki?
Well, they could. Yeah, they could be, but that's the Mesopotamian word for them.
Yeah.
You could call them the gods. You could call them Anunnaki. I prefer to simply call them our genetic cousins.
Okay.
Because I think that's what they were.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, I don't know, about Mars.
Yes.
And a moon that disappears.
Well, we were talking. That's not actually in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men.
Yes.
But we were talking privately about Phobos and Deimos,
Yeah.
the two moons of Mars.
Right.
And Phobos and Deimos are the Greek words fear and trembling, all right?
Yeah.
Fear being Phobos and Deimos being trembling. The interesting thing about those moons, Georgianne, is they were discovered, I think it was 1889. I'm not quite certain of that exact year, but I believe it was 1889.
Okay.
In other words, toward the end of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is, Georgianne, that the telescope technology to have discovered them existed at the beginning of the 19th century. Okay?
Yeah.
And, at that time, Mars was the planet that astronomers were the most fascinated by because of, Schiaparelli and Lowell and seeing the so-called canals and everything, and then seeing the seasons change on Mars and so on, looking through their telescopes. They speculated very early on that Mars might actually be a habitable planet. Mm-hmm. And that there might be people living there. So astronomers were constantly looking at Mars, all right?
Yeah.
So the real problem here, Georgianne, is, okay, if we're looking at Mars through our telescopes, and those telescopes are good enough at the time to have seen Phobos and Deimos, why were they not discovered earlier?
No.
Why did it take so long to discover those two moons?
Well, they weren't there.
Bingo. Bingo. They weren't there.
Oh.
So in other words, stop and consider what we just said. Mars didn't have two moons, and then all of a sudden in 1889, it has two moons.
They were brought there in part.
Yeah, well, that's kind of my thinking, is, okay, somebody parked them there.
Yeah.
Brought them from wherever and literally parked them there. And that whole idea is not, I want to stress something. That idea is not mine. If I recall correctly, it was a Russian astronomer, a Soviet astronomer that drew that conclusion, just based on the history of science, that, okay, why weren't these moons discovered beforehand? Well, they weren't there. And the reason that they're discovered all of a sudden is in 1889 is someone parked them there.
Well, it makes sense.
Sure.
It makes sense.
To say something like that, you can get away with saying something like that in Soviet Russia.
Yeah.
But perish the thought you should think that far out of the box in the West.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the Gospels, it mentions Deimos and Phobos, which
yes.
I think is very interesting.
Well, yeah, that's the other question that we were discussing, is why do these planets get named the way they get named,
Right.
But yeah, it's a very interesting thing that these moons just all of a sudden are there.
Oh, well, didn't Richard Hoagland have some information on his site about Phobos?
Yeah, he did. That was last year when the European Space Agency was releasing its pictures of Phobos. And he wrote, I believe, 2 papers on his website called For the World is Hollow, and I Have Touched the Sky. I believe that's the name of the paper.
Yeah.
And basically what he is arguing in that paper is that Phobos is artificial because it shows, even though it's a battered object beyond, all recognition, there is still enough regularity of geometry, over and over right-angled structures and so on and so forth,
yes.
that in his opinion, that this is a sign of artificiality. And given the amount of those kinds of right angles that do appear on the surface of Phobos, I'm inclined, and I underline the word inclined, to agree with him.
Well, I looked at those pictures
mm-hmm.
and magnified them, and
mm-hmm.
my goodness, Joseph, it looks like a neighborhood.
Yes, it does.
It does.
Yes, it does. And the other interesting thing that the European Space Agency released about Phobos, and I really have not heard a good explanation of this one, is that little moonlet is outgassing.
Oh.
In other words, it's hollow, so to speak.
Yeah.
And whatever's inside it, whatever atmosphere is inside it, is under pressure.
Oh. Oh.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting, yes.
Well, it's like the thing that we talked about, the Pathfinder on Mars.
Yeah, the little rover.
Yeah, I mean, somebody had to do that.
Someone came along with a little bottle of Windex and paper towels
and cleaned
our little rover off.
Yeah, because just before that, the pictures, the transmission was just garbled.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. There's so much space anomaly stuff going on that you can barely keep up with it anymore.
And look at Japan having released that video about the moon.
Yeah, that one, Georgianne, was. I saw that picture that the JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, released, and I have to tell you, Georgianne, when I opened up that file, my jaw dropped.
Yeah.
Because you're seeing clear color in this and a few odd little things on the surface, if you look carefully. I think that was a very, very significant release that the Japanese made.
Oh yes.
And what gets me about it, Georgianne, and this is purely a speculation.
Okay.
But when I saw that, my gut just said they released the least significant picture that they probably had. I suspect that they have a lot more.
Oh, yes.
And that release was I don't even know how to describe it. That release was a message to certain parties that want to keep a lot of that space stuff covered up, that we know. Yeah. And we can blow it wide open.
Well, it was a remarkable video.
Oh yes, it was.
And
there's no two ways about it, Georgianne. You're absolutely right. It was absolutely remarkable.
And you could see what looked like a bridge.
Oh yeah, that bridge structure, that in itself is a strange thing, because that was, if my memory serves me correctly, Georgianne, that was actually photographed telescopically from the Earth during the late 1950s. Most people don't realize that one of the first things that NASA did was a top-secret program to map the surface of the moon using telescopes based on Earth. Yeah. And that structure, if I remember correctly, was first noticed by one of those astronomers, and if I recall correctly, he obtained permission to publish the photograph, and the photograph showed the shadow being cast by that structure, whatever it is, and then, of course, the sunlight, shining through the hole. Yeah. Yeah. And scientists, astronomers came up with all sorts of, just in my opinion, goofy explanations as to how that got there. A meteorite came down, hit the surface of the moon, kind of skipped like a rock on the pond, punched a hole through this bluff, and created the image or illusion of a bridge. Oh, gee. That I'm serious. That's literally what they came up with.
Well, it looks like structures, like a base that's built in a bowl.
Yeah, it does look. It does look a bit like structure. And again, the explanations that astronomers kind of tried to come up with for that one, again, kind of left me wanting. I remember reading about this when I was a kid in elementary school, and I thought, come on, give me a break here. Meteorites skipping on the surface of the moon, and, geez, come on.
Oh. Well, let's dive off into Dr. Smirnoff.
Dr. Smirnoff, okay.
Yeah, and a whole string of things from that technology. Dissolution of memory, missing time, missing history, abductions, trances, hearing voices, seeing visions.
The other activity of the elite the possibility that I explore in the book is that you had the use of technology to, quite literally, to create religion.
Yes.
To manipulate perceptions, to create show-stopping special effects, so to speak.
Yeah.
And quite literally to engineer perceptions, emotions, responses, and even, so to speak, special revelations. Dr. Smirnoff was one of these Russians involved during the Soviet era in mind manipulation research.
Very brilliant man.
Yes, he was a very brilliant man. There's no doubt about that. He was a brilliant man. He was contacted, as I outline in the book, during the Waco siege to bring his technology to this country. He was contacted by the FBI to bring his technology to this country to see if they could use it to make David Koresh think that he was hearing the voice of God.
Yeah.
And would, order him to surrender to the FBI. All right. And at one point, Smirnoff was willing to go along with it until the FBI asked him if he would sign a waiver that in case anything happened, like a mass suicide or something, he would not hold the FBI liable, for misuse of his technology or something like that.
Yeah.
And at that point, of course, Dr. Smirnoff was duly and justifiably horrified.
Yes.
and withdrew his support. But the key point here is that the technology existed.
Yes.
To create these effects.
Yes. To
create these perceptions. And so my argument is, all right, if it existed, and if we are arguing that a sophisticated civilization once existed with sophisticated scientific techniques, it surely would have had a similar pitch of development in terms of its ability to use technologies to manipulate perceptions and human emotions. And so then the question becomes, well, if that's the case, then what if some of that technology survived in the hands of some of these elites? Mm-hmm. Might they have used it to create social movements? Might they have used it to socially engineer things, to manage perceptions? So in other words, if you admit the possibility of that kind of technology, and if you admit the possibility of knowledge of social engineering techniques,
yes,
then your reading of ancient texts perforce changes.
Yes.
As a possibility. So yeah, this stuff is, it's very, very broad and deep in its implications.
Well, to reiterate,
that
millions of people witnessed it at the Gulf War when thousands of soldiers threw up their arms, threw down their machine guns, and walked off and said, God told us to give up.
Yeah, there was, it was, I think, a combination of technique and technology.
Yeah.
Because those poor Iraqi soldiers were literally bombed into shell shock.
Yes.
They were they were on the receiving end of some just enormously heavy ordnance for a long period of time, too.
Yes.
And, that technique does something to the American psyche. And then if you add to that the deployment of some of this technology, to put voices of God into people's heads, I think you had clearly the use of some of that technology during the first Gulf War. So if you can dream of it now and admit the possibility that it might have existed in ancient times, you will find mass movements like that could have been manipulated.
Well, that brings up the other issue of the Middle East.
Yes. Yes.
What are the possibilities that technology is being used there?
I would admit the possibility. I would also admit the possibility that this also might be taking place as a natural human response to the changing physics of the medium. It might be also a possibility that, particularly in Egypt, where you have, pyramids all over the place,
yes,
that these things might somehow be in the process of being reactivated and, so to speak, beaming out consciousness effects.
Well,
for want of a better expression.
Didn't Zahi Hawass have those pyramids off limits? He had them barricaded, or? Well,
he built a wall around Giza. He didn't do that at every site in Egypt, but Giza itself, the three big pyramids right there outside of Cairo, yes, he had a wall built around the Giza plateau. Ostensibly, I think one of the explanations was they were trying to secure the site against vandals and terrorists and so on and so forth, which I think is kind of a funny explanation, at least with respect to the pyramids, because, no terrorist with a strap-on bomb is going to do much damage to those things. So I think there was another agenda in play there. I've always suspected that. There's no proof of it, but I've always suspected that really what he was trying to do was secure the site and make it as off-limits as possible while they were going around digging things up and not talking about it.
Yeah. Is there any more information about him being thrown in prison?
The last time I checked, the story was about 3 days ago, and apparently Dr. Hawass has decided to appeal the case. So the case is on appeal. If he loses the appeal, I guess in Egyptian law, and again, this is entirely hearsay, Georgianne, because I know nothing, obviously, about Egyptian law.
Yeah.
But the reports are that if he loses this case, yes, he could go to prison for a year.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, good grief.
Yeah.
Well,
there's a story there, Georgianne, that I'm not. Something about this whole Egyptian looting story and his role in it bothers me immensely. And I'm going to sound very strange here. There are a lot of people in the alternative research community that literally hate Dr. Hawass. And I have questions about the man and some of his stances and positions over the years.
Yes.
But I certainly don't hate the man. I mean, I've seen some real vociferous hatred of the man.
Oh.
And, I'm no friend of his positions on things. I'm no friend of his views on Egyptology by any stretch of the imagination, because he supports the standard line. The pharaohs built those three big pyramids there at Giza, and all the nonsense that Egyptologists have come up with those things. But Dr. Hawass, when the Egyptian looting was first reported, I started watching what he was posting on his personal website.
Yeah.
And, Georgianne, this is so peculiar. This is so very strange and peculiar. the first thing that Dr. Hawass reported was that vandals broke into the Cairo Museum. They stole a bunch of artworks, and in his words now, he said they were looking for, are you sitting down? Are you sitting down?
Cuneiform?
No. They were looking for red mercury.
Oh.
Remember what that stuff is, folks?
Oh, yeah.
That's the stuff that was the big nuclear scare
Yeah.
of the 1990s, of a substance supposedly confected in Soviet Russia,
Yes.
which gave you the ability to detonate hydrogen bombs without the necessity of an atomic bomb to set it off.
What?
So in other words, you would have a clean hydrogen bomb.
Well, what in the world would red mercury be doing in the Cairo Museum?
Well, that's my point, Georgianne.
Oh.
Hawass, by saying that,
Oh.
Hawass, by saying something so outlandish and so absurd,
Yeah.
you know, whether or not you believe red mercury was a hoax or not, you know,
Yeah.
whether or not you believe the story about red mercury, for Hawass to say that in that context is an absurdity.
Oh.
And I think he was, in my opinion anyway, I think he was sending some sort of message with that comment. But,
Yeah.
you know, I'm clueless as to whom he would be sending it to.
Oh, my gosh.
All right? Then the next thing that he came out with that really arrested my attention was he reported that among the things that were being looted around the country, at one particular site in Egypt, there had been the theft of a couple of, in his words again, inscribed stones.
Oh.
In other words, stones with hieroglyphics on them.
Yes.
You know, presumably from some Egyptian temple somewhere, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, what I find strange about that, Georgianne, pardon me, I don't know why my throat is so dry today, but what is so strange to me about that statement is it fits the pattern of the Baghdad Museum looting,
Oh.
where you had the theft of artworks and the theft of cuneiform tablets. And recall how that story developed. When the looting occurred, the U.S. appointed a Marine colonel to recover what had been stolen. His name was Bogdanovich, Colonel Bogdanovich.
Mm-hmm.
And the media reporting of the recovery of the stolen objects from the Baghdad Museum centered upon the return of the art objects. Nary a mention has ever been made of the 80,000 some plus cuneiform tablets that were looted.
Yes. Oh.
The only thing I've been able to find, pardon me, thus far, is one little news article about the Spanish government refusing to return some cuneiform tablets to Iraq until Iraq can prove the provenance on these tablets, that they were indeed stolen during that looting.
Yes.
Okay? And how in the name of sense did they end up in Spain?
Yeah.
You know? So the Egyptian museum looting is fitting the same pattern. You have the theft of, number one, art objects, and number two, objects with information on them.
Yes.
And I'll bet you dollars to donuts, Georgianne, that the only thing we're going to hear about in the media are the art objects and when they're returned to the museum.
No.
Those inscribed rocks that Dr. Hawass talked about openly on his website, I bet you we are never going to hear about them again.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And the interesting thing to me, Georgianne, is, you know, Hawass ran the Egyptian Department of Antiquities with an iron hand.
Oh, yes.
He knew every little detail of what was located where.
Mm-hmm.
For him to say inscribed rocks were stolen and not comment any further on what the inscriptions said or where they were from, that to me is also very interesting. It's another, to me it was another sort of message.
Yes.
that he was sending, that I know exactly what was stolen, but I'm not talking. I could talk, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, it might be healthier not to.
It might be healthier not to, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Joseph. Oh.
Yeah, it's to me, Georgianne, it's a huge story, and I'll be very blunt and honest. I think there may be something similar in play in Libya.
Ah.
Mm-hmm. I think that there is a possibility that one reason that you have the West trying to intervene in that whole mess is that some of them may be looking for some ancient stuff.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think it's a possibility.
Oh.
Now, if all of a sudden the Tripoli Museum is looted,
yeah,
you know, I'd say here we have a pattern, folks.
Yes, I was thinking the same word. Here we have a pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, Joseph. Wow.
Yeah, I think we're living in bizarre times.
Oh yes.
You know, I've always maintained, and people can call me crazy if they want to, but I've always maintained that one of the big, deeply hidden reasons for the American-British invasion of Iraq this last time around was to get their hands on some of this ancient stuff.
Yeah. No doubt.
Yep.
Oh. At the expense of killing millions of people.
Yep.
Oh my God.
Yep.
Oh. Well, Babylon's banksters.
Yes.
How old is religion?
Oh boy, that's such a loaded question. It depends on how you're defining religion. I'm going to propose a definition that a religion is a system of belief that claims to have been revealed.
Yes.
Okay. If you use that definition, I don't think religion is as old as, so to speak, philosophical cosmology.
Okay.
All right? In other words, on that basis, you cannot call Hinduism a religion.
Yes.
Because it's, Hinduism doesn't really have this notion of, well, it doesn't, but it doesn't really have this notion of a kind of special revelation or a prophet speaking for the name of God and so on and so forth. In other words, it doesn't have a Muhammad figure or a Moses figure in those senses.
Right.
So I think, if you take that definition, then religion is probably, depending on which area of the world you're looking at, too, that's the other problem. Religion itself, I'm going to say maybe 5,000, 6,000 years old, but I think there's evidence that you have philosophical cosmologies, so to speak, as I like to call them, that are in existence long, long before that.
Oh. Okay. Well, we know that the elites attached themselves to temples and priesthoods for the purpose of installing a financial monopoly over private issuance
of money,
of monetized debt.
Debt, right.
And for manipulating the bullion practices and policies of nations.
Yes.
How did they do it?
How did they do what? I'm not quite understanding what your particular question is.
Well, how did they go about communicating with each other? With each other? Yes, because, my gosh, Joseph, some of these places are hundreds of miles apart.
Well, yeah, that's the tie-in to Gene Stein's Monsters and Men.
And they didn't get there on camel.
No. No. In Gene Stein's Monsters and Men, in Babylon's Banksters, I point out that the research of Dr. Konstantin Meil, a German professor of engineering, indicates that some ancient temples are built as very, very primitive radio transmitter receivers. All right? So in other words, they quite literally had the means, a kind of a shortwave network by virtue of all these temples.
Yes.
All right, that they could communicate with each other. And I think that probably it was radio telegraphy. In other words, kind of like Morse code. All right.
Mm-hmm.
The tie-in with Gene's, pardon me, with Gene's Giants, Monsters, and Men, is that in that book, I also disclose something that Dr. Mile does not mention, or at least he didn't in his book that I cited in Babylon's Banksters.
Yeah.
And that is that many of these ancient temples are resonant to the theta and alpha brainwaves of the human brain. And those brainwaves are the brainwaves that either produce intense relaxation, meditative states, and so on, or a heightened sort of mental activity and acuity, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, not only were these temples in some cases designed as radio transmitters, they were also designed as, quite literally, mind manipulation technologies.
Oh.
Ho, ho, ho. So, in other words, there's the case. There was a primitive mind manipulation technology in play in some of these sites and in some of these architectures. So, again, that ups the ante a bit more, that in some cases with these ancient oracles and mystery schools and what have you, that you're dealing with an elite that has access to a technology that can do this sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, what about the priests that, the ephod that they wore?
The Hebrew high priest, what are you asking exactly?
Well, was that a communication device?
I think you're talking about the Urim and Thummim.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Urim and Thummim. The ephod is a bit different, although it's kind of connected in terms of the vestiture of the Hebrew high priest. But yeah, I think you can argue a case that, again, the behavior of Yahweh in using these things appears to be too reminiscent of a technology that he's using to communicate with.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I think there are little clues. They're certainly not conclusive clues, but there are clues or indicators that we might be looking at a technology even here.
Oh. And what about the Ark of the Covenant?
Well, I don't talk about that in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. There have been so many other authors that have talked about the Ark of the Covenant, pointing out that this has all the appearance of having been deliberately designed as a capacitor of some sort, and so on and so forth. There's been so many people that have written about that. I just didn't feel the need to, so
okay.
I don't talk about it at all.
Okay. Oh my goodness, Joseph. Oh, it is.
It's a staggering. It's a staggering scenario when you get right down to it.
Yes, it is.
It's a staggering scenario.
And how much of this ancient technology have the Germans refined?
Have the Germans refined?
Yes.
Well, I don't know why you're concentrating on the Germans. I think basically any country that has a sufficiently large economic base and technological base and is a fairly powerful country has been involved at some point, and probably is still involved, with a lot of this mind manipulation technology. Certainly true in the case of Russia.
Yes.
And certainly was true in the case of Nazi Germany. The problem with modern Germany is they are very, very quiet about their Black Projects research.
Yeah.
As are the French. But, there's no doubt in my mind that those countries do similar types of research. Certainly this country has.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly Communist China would be doing it. So basically anybody with a technological base and an economic base and that's a relatively powerful country would be doing it.
Oh my.
Now, that said,
yeah.
I'll let a little secret out. even though Grid of the Gods is in the arch of books that concern ancient technology and its implications for how we understand ancient history, even though it's in that arch of books, there's an entire chapter in it about, guess who? The Nazis. Because this is the scary thing, and no one knows to this day the details of this, what I'm about to tell you.
Okay.
The Nazis built many of their installations on parts of the grid.
Yes.
Including Hitler's East Prussia headquarters. You know, that big complex of concrete bunkers that is in East Prussia, where he ran the war against Russia. That was located very precisely on so-called ley lines, on so-called grid points.
Yeah.
And it was also located at a very unusual height above sea level, which I won't even mention what the significance of that height is in terms of the numerical coefficient that's involved in it, because it's another whopper.
Wow.
It's a whopper. And the other thing the Nazis did is that they would lay out many of their high-power radio transmitting facilities on these sites.
On these nodes.
On these nodes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, and it is very difficult to find information on this. I mean, I literally had to pay about $120 for one book that talked about this, and it's really the only book out there that does talk about it.
Oh, my gosh.
So, in other words, the information is that scanty on whatever it was the Nazis were doing with this grid stuff.
Yeah.
It's very, very unusual, but they clearly understood something about it. But it's anybody's guess as to what or how much they understood.
Do you remember Bruce Cathy?
Yes, I do. Sure do.
In one of his books, he described what he believed were UFOs.
Yes.
Flying low and
flying on the grid system.
Yeah, and punching something down in the ground, shooting something down in the ground. And I think his assumption was that they were trying to fix a broken grid.
Well, that's another part of the story. Again, without getting into too many details about a book that isn't out yet. Cathy's theories are unique in that they are conceptually sound,
yes,
in my opinion, but in their details, not so.
Okay.
He's not the only one that has noticed that UFOs seem to be active the most along these grid lines and nodal points. All right?
Yeah.
Now, as for the idea, could they be trying to repair the grid system? That's a fascinating topic because it implies that it's broken.
Yes.
All right? And if it's broken, when did it get broken? And so on and so forth. Now, I don't get into those questions in the Grid of the Gods for a very simple reason. And the reason is that there has been no, in my opinion, thorough enough study of the phenomenon of the grid and the different types of structures upon it, and an analysis of possible physics in play that is sufficient enough to ascertain exactly what the purpose of this grid system was.
Yeah.
I have suspicions about certain sites on the grid, and that's what I concentrate on in the book.
Yeah.
But as for the system as a whole, my guess is that it's a partially broken system. I don't make any speculation about UFOs in connection with it. I speculate about something else that, when people read the first chapters, I think is going to blow their mind.
Oh, I'm sure it will.
Well, because this book does not start in ancient times, even though it's about ancient architecture and the possible physics involved. The first 2 chapters are concerned with the modern era.
Yes.
And the possibility that both the United States and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany discovered something about the grid system and aren't talking.
Oh.
Yeah, and you're never going to believe what and how they may have discovered it.
Oh my goodness.
Because when you read the peculiar connection to the Nazis in this, particularly in the first chapter, things that I've already written about, but no one has made that one detailed little connection between a certain guy down in Argentina doing stuff for Juan Perón and the world grid.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a whopper.
Oh my goodness.
It's one of those little teeny details that knocks a whole lot of official explanation into a great big huge cocked hat.
Oh my goodness, Joseph. You've done it again.
Well, I don't know if I've done it again, but I think I've certainly will have given a lot of people some things to ponder.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, everybody visit GizaDeathStar.com and be sure to give that PayPal button a workout. And
do the same for Georgianne too, please.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. And we'll be back with more with Joseph P. Farrell. Good night, and God bless everybody out there.
Good night.